Judges 13. Again, I want to thank you for filling out the survey. One of the characters that was mentioned in that was to cover the life of Samson. And I read over the story a couple times while we were out there at the pastor's retreat. And I felt impressed that God would have us spend just a few weeks. It's not a long story by any means, but to spend just a few weeks covering the life of Samson. Some pretty amazing things that happen within this few short chapters. And some of the lessons I believe would be helpful for us. And I'm not going to read the whole story today. I considered doing so, but I'm just going to read a portion of it. Instead, I'm going to give you homework to read the whole story of Samson. I know, 4 chapters, big chapters, no. Judges 13, 14, 15, and 16, not very long, but if you schedule some time this week to sit down and read the story of Samson, and maybe if you want extra credit, read the story of Samson, sleep on it, and then read it again. There's something to be said. I don't know the scientific words to fill in, but there is something to be said about reading or doing something, sleeping. It's like your mind categorizes all of it, and then coming back to it again and reading it, and you just see things differently. Yes?
You said 13, 14, 16, so not 15?
13, 14, 15, 16. Okay. Sorry. All 4 chapters, yep. So, and if you have any questions or thoughts or anything like that, write them down. Bring them. We can work through them together in case I don't bring them up because I'm not going to cover everything about Samson. This morning I would like to read the first 5 verses of Judges 13, and then I would like to skip all the way to the end of chapter 16 and read the last 11 verses. The beginning of the story and the end of the story. The beginning of the story begins this way. And the children of Israel did evil again in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them into the hand of the Philistines 40 years. And there was a certain man of Zorah, of the family of the Danites, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren and bare not. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto the woman and said unto her, Behold, now, thou art barren and bearest not, but thou shalt conceive and bear a son. Now, therefore, beware, I pray thee, and drink not wine, nor strong drink, and eat not any unclean thing. For lo, thou shalt conceive, and bear a son, and no razor shall come on his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite unto God from the womb, and he shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines. And now turn over to chapter 16. Chapter 16, the last few verses there. Judges 16, and I'll start in verse 20. And she said, that is, Delilah said to Samson, The Philistines be upon thee, Samson. And he awoke out of his sleep and said, I will go out as other times before and shake myself. And he wist not, he did not know, that the Lord was departed from him. But the Philistines took him and put out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza and bound him with fetters of brass, and he did grind in the prison house. Howbeit the hair of his head began to grow again after he was shaven. Then the lords of the Philistines gathered them together for to offer a great sacrifice unto Dagon their god and to rejoice, for they said, Our God hath delivered Samson, our enemy, into our hands. And when the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, Our God hath delivered into our hands our enemy, the destroyer of many of our country, which slew many of us. And it came to pass, when their hearts were merry, that they said, Call for Samson, that he may make us sport, he may perform for us. And they called for Samson out of the prison house, and he made them sport, he performed for them, and they set him between the pillars. And Samson said unto the lad that held him by the hand, Suffer me that I may feel the pillars whereupon the house standeth, that I may lean upon them. Now the house was full of men and women, and all the lords of the Philistines were there, and there were upon the roof about 3,000 men and women that beheld while Samson made sport. And Samson called unto the Lord and said, O Lord God, remember me, I pray thee, and strengthen me, I pray thee, only this once, O God, that I may be at once avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes. Samson took hold of the 2 middle pillars upon which the house stood, and on which it was borne up, of the one with his right hand, and of the other with his left. And Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." And he bowed himself with all his might, and the house fell upon the lords and upon all the people that were therein. So the dead which he slew at his death were more than they which he slew in his life. Then his brethren and all the house of his father came down and took him and brought him up, and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol, in the burying place of Manoah his father, and he judged Israel 20 years. And that's it. That's the beginning and the end of Samson. And in between, there's about 4 stories. And that's all. Today, I want to introduce the series title, if you will, for Samson, and maybe give you a bit of an interesting or unique thought, probably not original to me, I would not suppose, but something that jumped out at me as I read past this. I've heard numerous messages and series over Samson and through Judges, all of which have been helpful and edifying to my Christian life, but maybe today I see Samson with a slightly different perspective. And that is that I see it not simply as a Christian in a pew, but a Christian whose job it is now to stand behind a pulpit. To be clear, I'm not trying to say that the job of the judges judging Israel is a one-to-one comparison with the job of a pastor. Maybe, I suppose, to some pastors it feels that way. Maybe to some churches it feels that their pastor is their judge. But that is not the case that I'm trying to make here. Rather, if you look at the judges, you'll find men and a woman who did not necessarily desire to be put in this position, did not necessarily have the qualifications to do that job, and yet what did God do? He chose them and called them out and put them in a place of authority over the people of Israel to judge them. In the realm of pastor, there's certainly a desire of aspect, or an aspect of desire for the work, but there's always an element of being thrust into a position over people, if you will, to a degree. Obviously, I am among you, but I'm not over you. But put into a position for which I am not necessarily qualified. Except for my children in here today, all of you are older than I am. I'm 33. I'm young, exactly. I don't have the qualifications to necessarily minister to you because you've got a lot more experience than I do and are probably a lot wiser than I am.
I don't know about that.
And yet, God has chosen to put me in this place to minister to you, to minister from His word to you through the Spirit.
And He leads you.
And He does, yes. We only have a small snippet of Samson. Let me try that again. We only have a small snippet of Samson's life. We don't know what Samson necessarily thought about himself. And we could say this about any of the judges, to be honest. We get some glimpses with other characters in the Bible, but we don't know what was going through Samson's mind for the 20 years he judged Israel. We know, based on a couple spots, what he was thinking in his mind for like 4 or 5 days maybe. But for 20 years of judging Israel, what were the thoughts that went in his mind? How did Samson deal in his inner core with his own failings? We get to step back and we look from an outside perspective, and we look at the multiple failings over the course of Samson's life. And really, pretty much everything we're given about Samson is he failed. That's about the way it feels anyway. But during the course of his life, we get to see what? How God worked in Samson's life in spite of his failures. In spite of Samson. Yeah. And therein is the wonder and the thought that I want to draw your attention to today. Samson was merely this: a flawed man in God's hands. A flawed man in God's hands. And so, number one, consider with me a curious question. A curious question. We will encounter in chapter 13, verse number 18, the word secret. It's also translated in other translations as wonderful, and possibly other words too. But the literal meaning of that word is beyond understanding. And we're going to deal with the context of it when we come to it next week. But the gist of it is this: why are you asking me, the angel of the Lord responding to Manoah, why are you asking me to explain something to you that is currently and will continue to be fully beyond your understanding? That's what the angel of the Lord asked him. And Barry Webb says of that word's root word, in other words, the word translated secret or wonderful, the root word is pele, which we would say today is wonder. It is used 13 times in the Old Testament as a whole. Always in connection with God, especially his acts of salvation and judgment in history, his laws, his final acts of apocalyptic judgment, and, in one case, his Messiah. Beyond understanding. Again, we'll deal with it more fully next week, but what stood out to me regarding Samson, regarding this incomprehensibility, this fantastic wonder, and add to those two thoughts who I am. Add to those three thoughts who you are. And it's this curious question: why would God use me? Or maybe rephrased even better, how could God use me? I wouldn't say necessarily by my nature that I'm an insecure person. I'd say I'm fairly self-assured, fairly comfortable with myself, my own skin. My insecurity would be that I would offend someone else because I'm fully willing to be myself in front of others, such that I will, again, I worked for a police department for many years in emergency services for many years. I use a lot of dark humor. That's how we grew up, what we learned. That's just who I am. And so in front of others, I will make a off-color, if you will, and dark, humorous joke about something that should not be made, for most people anyway. And so my insecurity would be saying something to the wrong person at the wrong time and offending them. And that just being who I am. So I'm not necessarily insecure, but that being said, in my role as a Christian, and now even in the role as a pastor, I do face insecurity at times, and I'm sure you could say during the course of your Christian life that you've run across these things too, facing insecurity and understanding how God would want to use me. Why would he pick me? Knowing who I am, you knowing who you are, why would God then say, I want to use you? I want you to do this. Now, at first glance, to me, it makes sense. I can understand how God would want to use my pastor growing up. I can understand how God would want to use my professors and other pastors along the way and teachers that have helped me. I can understand why God would want to use them because, they had everything put together. They were humble. They were great men and women of God. They were faithful. There was so much. They were good. I can understand why God would want to use them. They're holy, they're sanctified. But why would God want to use me? Knowing who I am, God knowing who I am, why would God want to use me? Who am I that God would use me? I understand that's a bit more personal than maybe we would normally say it on a Sunday morning, but I suspect that you probably identify with that statement to some degree or another at some point in time in your life. You might not be the pastor, but you serve a purpose among this body. And there are things about you that only you know. There's things about me that only I know. And because of those things, we have probably likely wrestled with the question, how can God use me? How could God use me to minister to hurting people? How could God use my story to bring others to him? How could God use me to witness to strangers? How could God use me to lead in the singing and the worship of him? How could God use my money to further the work in the church? How can God use me as a deacon or leader within the church? How could God use me to encourage other believers? How could God use me, a younger person, to encourage older people? How could me, an older person, be used by God to encourage younger people? How can God do all? Why would God want to use me knowing what he knows about me? It's a curious question. Number 2, however, we happen upon a concerning subject. A concerning subject. As you read through Judges 13, 14, 15, and 16, you will notice a continual theme. Samson doing things that Samson should not be doing. It's kind of like what Paul said. The things I don't want to do, I do those things. Samson's unwise and even sinful choices in many times are recorded for us. Just a highlight of them, chapter 14, begins with his insistence to marry a Philistine woman against his mother and father's advice and against God's commands against intermarriage with the other tribes. Later on, he eats honey out of the carcass of a lion that he had killed previously, violating his Nazirite vow not to come in contact with that which is dead. And we'll consider more about the Nazirite vow next week when we come to it. Chapter 14 also records for us that there was a feast held. Now, we're not specifically told that Samson partook in alcohol at that feast. However, based on his other character choices, the fact that he probably consumed alcohol at this Philistine feast makes logical sense to me that he probably did that. Knowing his willingness to break his vow elsewise, I don't see why he wouldn't have broke it there too. Maybe he did. In chapter 15, Samson seeks vengeance upon the Philistines by sending out the foxes and burning the fields. In chapter 16, we begin with him in the arms of a prostitute. He then goes on to build this terrible relationship with Delilah, whose only goal was to betray him and be contrary to him the whole time. And so I don't even have any idea what's going on there, but that undermining relationship is a mess. In short, Samson is angry, vengeful, reckless, prideful, adulterous, presumptuous, lustful, and that's just a little bit. And I'm sure you could add some more in there. And when we look at that view of Samson, when we step out and we look at Samson, and we would probably look at him and we would grimace and say, I don't know if God would want to use somebody like that today. Could God actually use a concerning subject like that? Would he still do that today? My submission is that God has and still does use men like Samson today. I got 15 names here for you. Maybe some that you know, maybe some that you don't know. Men like Ravi Zacharias, Steve Lawson, Robert Morris, Jack Hiles, Jack Scott, Jimmy Swaggart, Mark Driscoll, James McDonald's, Bill Hybels, Carl Wentz, Brian Houston, Mike Bickle, Jim Baker, Tony Evans, Michael Brown. All men that were at one point in time, and don't worry, I know that's a very broad brush of people that we would likely not agree with everything on for them. And I'd have some concerns about salvation in potential cases even. But all that with a broad brush, all that to say this, the evidence seems to show God used those men at various points in times in their ministries And at the same time that God used them, what do we find, and what did we find out about their personal lives after the fact? They were engaged in some horrendous, evil, wicked sins, and even some that maybe even we wouldn't classify as horrendous or evil, just sinful behavior. And so when we look at Samson and we look at pastors today, we could look at both of them, and that's just 15, and those are high profile. That's not to include the average pastor, if you will. But we'd say what? Samson's flawed. Pastors are flawed. And then if we were to boil it even farther down, amongst the whole church, what would we find? Christians are flawed. Yeah. Why do pastors keep falling? Why do church members keep falling into sin? And I understand that there's a lot of reasons why we can trace the step backs to how so-and-so fell into this and ended up in this place. But at the most basic root of the problem would be this: we are all flawed. We are all rotten apples, if you will. Especially in comparison with God, who is holy, and the law that he gave that evidences how bad we are. Now, that being said, God's grace is such that he can take the most rotten of apples and clean them up and make them new and make them something to be desired. A curious question, a concerning subject, and finally, a complimentary answer. And that is this: God uses flawed men and flawed women in spite of their sins. God, in his infinite wisdom, could have decided to only use those perfect people he knew would never fall, he knew would never sin, he knew would never make mistakes, and yet God, over and over and over and over again, has chosen to use flawed men in spite of their sins. Just look at the scriptures. You work backwards. What do you run into? Moses. A murdering man. And God used him. He had a lot of insecurities. Oh, God, I can't do that. No, I can't do that at all. Yeah. He tried his best to get out of it. You step back even farther, who do you run into? You run into people like Isaac, and Jacob, and Abraham, and then we'll run into David, exactly. You look at all these men that made serious errors along the way. And of course, as you go forward and you run into David and Solomon and Saul, and you run into characters in the New Testament, Peter and Paul, and what do you find is the common denominator with all of them? They make mistakes. They sin. They are flawed. And yet, God used those men and even women. The one that came to mind earlier was Rahab. Think of who Rahab was, and yet what did God do? Use her to save a nation. In spite of all their flaws and all their sinful behavior, God chose to use them to accomplish feats for his kingdom that are beyond our understanding. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that this is an excuse to sin. This is not I sinned, but God still uses me. Okay, cool. Let's just keep on sinning. That's not, Paul debunks that very thoroughly in his writings. No, it's not an excuse to sin because, as the old saying goes, be sure your sin will find you out. If not here in this life, all will be revealed one day. Rather, consider the fact that God uses flawed people in spite of their sins, to be an encouragement for you when you sin. And to be honest, it doesn't even necessarily have to be sin particularly. It could just be insecurity of, how could God use me? Just knowing my past, knowing where I came from, knowing the family I was born into, knowing what happened in my past. How could God use me?
That makes grace even more.
Of grace even more, absolutely. It's not an excuse to sin, rather it's an encouragement. So when you find yourself looking back and you're wondering, well, how could I lose my temper yet again? How could I have lusted after that woman or that man again? How could I overindulge in alcohol or food or something else again? How could I covet after that thing that I know I can't have again? How could I hope for evil to befall that person yet again? How could I be lifted up and how could I be so prideful yet again? How could I say that thing that I promised I was never ever going to say again, and yet I did it again and again? How could I idolize that person or that place or that thing again? And I've tried so hard, and yet I did it again. The encouragement is this: God chose to use flawed men and women, and God still chooses to use flawed men and women. And God works in spite of those flaws to do things that bring him honor and glory, that further the kingdom of God, things that are beyond our understanding, things that are wonderful. I'd like you to consider Paul's opening words to the church in Corinth. He says in 1 Corinthians 1, verse 17, "For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with eloquent wisdom, so that the cross of Christ will not be emptied of its effect. For the word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but it is the power of God to us who are being saved. For as it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, I will set aside the intelligence of the intelligent. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the teacher of the law? Where is the debater of this age? Hasn't God made the world's wisdom foolishness? For since in God's wisdom the world did not know God through wisdom, God was pleased to save those who believe through the foolishness of what is preached. For the Jews ask for a sign and the Greeks seek for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles. Yet to those who are called, both Jews and Greek, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. Because God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. Brothers and sisters, consider your calling. Not many were wise from a human perspective, not many powerful, not many of noble birth. Instead, God has chosen what is foolish in the world to shame the wise, and God has chosen what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God has chosen what is insignificant and despised in the world, what is viewed as nothing, to bring to nothing what is viewed as something, so that no one may boast in his presence. It is from him that you are in Christ Jesus, who became wisdom from God for us, our righteousness, sanctification, and redemption, in order that, as it is written, let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord. In other words, it's not the only reason, but one of the primary reasons I seem to understand is this, is why God would use me is so that it would be clear to me, that it would be clear to you, and that it would be clear even to the world that it's not me, it's him. He did it all. I didn't do it. He did it. I don't boast in myself because I know myself. Anything good I have done is simply a result of him. Just a flawed man in God's hands. And maybe saved by grace. And hopefully I'll be a little less flawed tomorrow than I am today. But a flawed man in God's hands is the kind of man that God has chosen to do things beyond our ability to comprehend. A flawed woman in God's hands is the one that God has chosen to use to do things beyond our comprehension. And so I'm certain that I am among brothers and sisters to whom God has revealed and made known the good news of Jesus Christ. That Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of which Paul would say, of whom I am chief. And I'm sure we'd probably all echo his words. To redeem, to save, to rescue us from the clutches of the devil and sin, and to find and trust in Jesus through his crucifixion and resurrection. Our trust in him provides us salvation. And yet, though we have been rescued, we have not been removed from this world. And we feel the effects of this world and the effects of sin, especially when we participate in sin. And over again, we find ourselves convicted of how sinful we are, and yet in that conviction, there is encouragement that though we are flawed, we still remain in God's hands. Though we will be flawed, hopefully less and less day by day, hopefully we're made more and more into the image of Christ day by day through sanctification, which is what God desires for us to become more like his Son. But though we are flawed and though we live in a flawed world, until the day he comes to take us home, our encouragement is this: we are still in God's hands. Might be flawed, but I'm in his hands. And God, it seems, delights in working out and showing his grace through flawed people. Using flawed men and women to bring a world of flawed people to know the glorious gospel of Jesus Christ. How they can be renewed and brought into a right relationship with God. And so I don't know, maybe this was not necessarily for you today. Maybe it'll be for you down the road. I know it was for me this week, and I pray that it encourages you. Just an interesting thought from the life of Samson, and we'll dive more into the day by day of Samson starting next week. Let's pray.